Did you know that Adolf Hitler's own father was born in a village that Hitler's own army then wiped completely off the map? More than 40 towns vanished for it. One of them had stood since the year 1143. And the strangest part isn't that it disappeared. It's why one specific graveyard in it was deliberately, personally targeted. Let me take you to the Waldviertel. This story detonates in March 1938. Austria is swallowed by Nazi Germany in the event they called the Anschluss. Suddenly, Berlin has a fresh pool of Austrian men to shove into the Wehrmacht. And soldiers need somewhere to practice killing. So, the regime eyes roughly 20,000 hectares of quiet Austrian farmland. But the part most people miss is still coming. Here's the mechanism. To build a military training ground, you need empty land. And this land was not empty. According to Atlas Obscura, more than 40 towns and countless surrounding farms were expropriated to create it. Döllersheim was the heart of it, first recorded in 1143, nearly 8 centuries of continuous life. Families who had farmed the same fields for generations were handed papers and told to leave. The evacuations rolled through in stages, and by 1941, the last stubborn holdouts were gone. Roughly 7,000 people were pushed out across the whole zone. That means grandparents who were born in those houses, married in that church, and expected to be buried in that soil, were suddenly refugees in their own country. Some were resettled onto farms, confiscated from others. Some got nothing but a train ticket and a promise that was never kept. Think about what that does to a person. You don't just lose a house. You lose the entire physical record of your family, the church register, the tombstones, the well your great-grandfather dug. The Döllersheim parish books, birth after birth going back centuries, were suddenly inconvenient. And inconvenient records in the Third Reich had a way of disappearing. And here's the mini payoff on why now. The Nazis weren't collecting real estate. They were manufacturing a weapon. This ground became, and remains today, the largest military training area in all of Austria, still known as the Truppenübungsplatz Allensteig. It exists because a regime needed to turn Austrian villages into practice targets for Austrian sons. A like on this does more than you'd think to get it seen. But there's a personal reason this particular corner of Austria was chosen, and it points straight at the top of the Reich. What comes next is the part that actually matters. Here's the angle almost nobody connects. Döllersheim sits right beside a village called Strones, and Strones is where Alois Hitler, Adolf Hitler's father, was born in 1837. Alois was born out of wedlock. His mother was a woman named Maria Anna Schicklgruber. For years, Alois carried her name Schicklgruber before he took the surname Hitler at age 39 in 1876. Historians have pointed out the obvious ugly joke buried here. The world came within a signature of chanting Heil Schicklgruber, and that detail haunted the Führer, because a leader preaching racial purity did not want historians poking around a murky, undocumented family tree in a poor Austrian hamlet. There were rumors, never proven, that Alois's real father was a Jewish man in Graz named Frankenberger. True or not, the rumor alone was radioactive to a man building a cult of blood. So consider what a military training zone conveniently does. It seals off an entire region. It bulldozes buildings. It empties churches. And it makes graveyards inaccessible to the public, permanently. Maria Anna Schicklgruber, Hitler's own grandmother, was buried in the cemetery at Döllersheim. Now here is the villain, the victim, and the uncomfortable middle. The villain is a regime willing to erase 40 living villages. The victims are thousands of ordinary Austrians, the farmers of the Waldviertel, turned out with nothing, many of them dying far from the ground that held their ancestors. And caught in the center is one dead woman's grave, a grave that connected the most powerful man in Europe to a story he wanted buried, literally. Why does this touch you? Because it's a lesson in how power rewrites its own past. When someone controls the ground, the records and the maps, they can make a fact simply cease to exist, and most people never notice the edit. Think about how much of what you accept as history is just whatever survived the people who wanted it gone. The training area went up, the villages came down, and the official reason was always military necessity, clean, bureaucratic, deniable. But the timing, the location, and that one grandmother's grave have made historians uneasy for decades. The last piece is the one that reframes everything. So what actually happened to the grave? The historical record here is genuinely murky, and that murkiness is the point. There are persistent accounts and long-standing claims that Maria Anna Schicklgruber's grave and the Döllersheim cemetery were deliberately destroyed on Hitler's orders, that the artillery and tanks weren't only training, they were erasing. Some versions trace the intervention to Hitler's own lawyer, Hans Frank, who investigated the family history and reportedly delivered findings the Führer never wanted spoken again. Historians still argue about how much was direct order and how much was the brutal indifference of a firing range rolling over a condemned town. What is not in dispute, the cemetery where Hitler's grandmother lay was inside the zone. The village was leveled. The area was shelled for years, right through the war. Here's the insight that lands hardest. The very regime obsessed with bloodlines and ancestry chose to obliterate its own leader's ancestral village. The purity myth required the origin story to be unknowable. So the origin was blown apart. Now, the promised number. That village Döllersheim was first mentioned in 1143. Nearly 800 years of human life, marriages, harvests and burials, ended in a matter of months to build a gunnery range. Here's my prediction for what happens next. That training ground is still active Austrian military land today, which means large parts of Döllersheim remain sealed off and slowly returning to forest. It will never be rebuilt, and every few years, a new researcher will go back to the Waldviertel, stand at the ruined church tower that still pokes above the trees, and try again to prove exactly whose grave the shells were aimed at. The stones are still out there. The answer may be buried with them. Before I go, here is your historical footnote of the day. Döllersheim wasn't the only ghost town made by a firing range. In England in 1943, the entire village of Tyneham in Dorset was evacuated for army training during the Second World War. The residents were promised they could return when the war ended. They never were allowed back. On the church door, a villager pinned a note asking the soldiers to treat the homes kindly because the people had given them up to help win the war. 80 years later, Tyneham is still an empty shell inside a live firing range, a whole community frozen at the moment they walked out. That is your footnote for today. If you were shaken by the idea that Hitler's own grandmother's grave sat inside that shelled-out village, share this with someone who loves buried history. That's it for today. Subscribe to Weird History. There's a new one every day.